Hi everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Matthew Turner. I'm a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers and chair of the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. And this is our event jointly with SME for Labour and Unite about hunger in the 21st century and whether we need a right to food and other social rights. Before I introduce the panel, let me just give some context. Since 2019, the Labour Campaign for Human Rights has been running a campaign called our Social Rights Campaign, which has a very specific ask. We want Labour to commit to a Social Rights Act, which would be like a Human Rights Act 2.0, enshrining into domestic law the economic, social and cultural rights that we already recognise internationally, like the rights to food, housing, education, social security and work. And 2 years ago at conference, we hosted a very similar event, jointly with Human Rights Watch, on the right to food. Shortly after that, Labour did commit in the last manifesto to a right to food. It was the only economic, social and cultural right that was committed to in our last manifesto. And at that time, 2 years ago, we were here talking about food poverty in Britain. I just wrote down, 2 years ago, we were talking about, at that time, how food bank usage had increased from 2008 to 2019 by 5,000%. Pre-financial crisis and pre-Conservative government, food banks weren't really a thing. And now they're prolific. And also at that time, 2 years ago, we were talking about the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty's visit to Britain, where he wrote absolutely scathing report about the levels of sort of Victorian-style poverty we now see in this country. That was 2 years ago, okay? What's happened since? We've had a whole pandemic, which has obviously hit the poorest the hardest in lots of different ways. And now as we exit the pandemic or enter the final phases, we're starting to see more pernicious policies hitting the poor and the working poor through national insurance rises, the cruel scrapping of the £20 universal credit, and a fuel crisis. So the situation has worsened, but here we are again to talk about, hopefully, what can be done to rectify some of this damage and what a future Labour government would do to enshrine the right to food into law and to really end this epidemic of food poverty in 21st century Britain. So that's the context. Let me introduce the panel. We've got Ian Byrne, MP, who's relatively newly elected MP for Liverpool West Derby, and he's the co-founder of Fans Supporting Food Banks. He's on Labour Campaign for Human Rights' advisory group, and he's sort of made it his main focus since becoming an MP is the right to food, and he's the leader of the Right to Food campaign, which has gained enormous traction over the last year. It's been fantastic to see. He'll talk more about that. To my right here is Laura Smith from Unite. She's the National Political Officer at Unite, a former teacher and a former MP for Crewe and Nantwich. The far right is Clive Baldwin, who's the Senior Legal Advisor at Human Rights Watch. And he was one of the contributors to Human Rights Watch's sort of seminal report from 2019 on food poverty and the right to food called Nothing Left in the Cupboards. Nothing Left in the Cupboard. To my left is Dr. Caldo Councillor. He is a law lecturer at the University of Essex, and he's the director of the Human Rights Clinic there. He's also the former policy director at Just Fair, and he's actually co-drafted the first bill that's been proposed. It's more an academic project at the moment, but a draft bill on economic, social and cultural rights.
Until Parliament is ready. For now.
And it's ready.
For now it's only academic.
Yeah, sure, exactly. It's oven ready. Sorry. And on my left, we've got Tom McNeil, who's a lawyer and the Assistant Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands, and he's also on the Board of Directors of the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. And all of them will be bringing sort of different perspectives, legal, practical, political, to this issue of food poverty and the right to food. So that's the context. We'll hear from each of the speakers for something like 8 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to a Q&A. So without further ado, if we could start with you, Ian.
Thanks, Matt. And look, I'm really humbled to be here. I've never had a clap before the start. I've never had a clap at the finish, to be honest. But look, really humbled to be here today with such an outstanding panel. It's great to see many of the people actually in person, because we've had Zoom calls, haven't we, over the last 18 months. So when Matt asked me to speak on this, I was absolutely delighted. I think I'm going to take you on a little journey now for the next 8 minutes about how it started, how rightly it was said that since I came in 2019, I've targeted the right to food. So in 2015, I was an organiser for Unite the Union, and getting on with my life, organising factories, and we had a meeting in Anfield with one of the community leaders, and I live 5 minutes from Anfield football ground, so it was right in my area. And we sat down with the community leader, and there was a queue of people outside in the afternoon, and me thinking they'll all go on a bingo, because I knew a couple of the people in the queue. So I said to Ruth, who was the leader of the centre, it's busy this afternoon. She said, yes, the food bank here. So I said, well, this is the food bank. So I think that realisation that I lived in that area and I didn't have an innate understanding of what was actually happening in my area shamed me, to be honest. Then she took me into the back and she showed us what they were giving out. It was with Dave Kelly at the time, who's the other co-founder. He's the Evertonian, one you always see on social media with a sad face. And he took us in the back, and he had a big bag of pasta. And for people my age, you remember the sweet bags you used to get, but he was putting the pasta into the sweet bags and giving it to people from my class, my community, and they were going away with it. And it left such a lasting impact in me. I'll never forget it till the day I die. So couldn't sleep that night. I spoke to Dave, we'd done stuff on fan activism before, and I said, what can we do? So we come up with a concept, which was fan sport food banks, which basically Liverpool and Everton are within 3/4 of a mile of each other, some of the poorest constituencies, wards in the country. And we asked football fans to bring tin of food. Now, it's really important, this concept, because it builds into the right to food. So that starts in 2015, very humble beginnings. Over the next 6 years, it grew both locally and nationally. So just before the pandemic, we were supplying 35% of all food was going into the local food banks. Liverpool food banks was coming from the football fans, which is some achievement. That was spread right across the country as well. So Newcastle were doing phenomenal work. And what we were doing was building up a network of like-minded individuals right throughout the country. So from Durham to Brighton, we had football fans in communities building, fighting against food poverty, but we were using it as a tool to educate and then keep pushing back, because everything we do and every person who does fantastic work on the ground fighting food poverty, and put into context of where we are now at the moment, fan support food banks in Liverpool fed 4,000 people last month with our mobile food pantries. We're going to be upscaling that, doubling the capacity because of the universal credit cut, so it'd be 8,000 people. So that's just in Liverpool alone. That's what we do on the ground. It's a stick and plaster. It's a stick and plaster. It truly is, and that's why the right to food was so important as a concept, which was in the 2019 manifesto. So for me, doing all that, and then privileged to be elected in 2019 to represent Liverpool West Derby, my sole focus was always going to be what I was seeing in my communities and give me a political element of it where I could actually take the grassroots movement and fuse it with the political elements, because we always knew the only solution to this is a political solution. Politicians cause poverty, politicians can solve poverty. So from 2019 we went right into the Right to Food campaign, trying to lay down EDMs, basically with the idea of keeping it in the manifesto, the National Manifesto. We were delighted it was in the 2019 manifesto, so I've seen that as my duty to keep working there, keep pushing it. October 2020, I sat down on an EFRA select committee and Henry Dimbleby came before me and I call it the Blues Brothers moment because it wasn't like he talked about the National Food Strategy and I said, well, that's an opportunity for the right to food. It's without winning an election, that's something here and now we can push. So that's where the Right to Food campaign really started gathering momentum, shall we say. You know, looking at what you've done, Human Rights Watch, and you know, I was speaking to Carter, who's a colleague, and he was saying that the Right to Food campaign was a little bit dry. So what we tried to do was fuse it with what we built from 2015. So we have Fan Support and Food Bank's national collective groupings, and then fuse the political element to it. So the idea was to put the whole of this movement behind asking Henry Dimbleby to include the Right to Food in the National Food Strategy. So we really got cracking then in October. So we put a model motion together, we put petitions, EDMs again, and it really caught fire because obviously people are seeing it in their communities and how do they fight back, how do they do something, how do they raise the issue of food poverty in their communities. And from January last year, it went through Liverpool City Council and it was Liverpool becoming the first city to become a Right to Food city. We also galvanised trade union movements, civic movements, the medical communities around it because it had to be a mass movement. If you're going to move this government, if you're going to move, at the moment politically it's extremely difficult for the Labour Party, as we all know. So we had to build a movement pushing from every potential angle. So I'm extremely proud to say from January to this month, you know, we've got about, I think it's 25 cities and towns that have declared. It was in Steve Rotherham's manifesto, it was in Andy Burnham's manifesto, which was, you know, it was some achievement really from a grassroots campaign to get it in the manifestos. So we was keep pushing. And last week was a huge week for the Right to Food campaign. We had Sheffield, Coventry and Birmingham declared themselves Right to Food cities. And then the TUC put a model motion through, which every affiliated trade union, it was put forward by the Bakers Union, and every affiliated trade union movement signed up, trade union signed up to it. So that's a fantastic achievement showing what can be done building this campaign. Now where we are now, sadly, Henry Dimbleby, who had all the right intentions in my opinion, did not put the submission which we made in April into the Right to Food, into the National Food Strategy which we brought up back in July. Now we sat down with Henry in April, me, Shami Sharfabati, members of the group that we pulled together, medical professors from Liverpool, and we put together this 5 submissions. I'm not going to go through them now. You go on my website, and I hate saying that as though like yourself promoting, but it's all there, everything's there, so you can take the time at leisure and go through it. But I'd say one of the key submissions was universal free school meals for every child in this country, including school dinners and obviously a breakfast. That was something we massively wanted to push on, and we believe it's achievable. And just to put this into context, and I have to say this, was thinking about it last night. When I approached certain individuals within the party about the right to food, I got told about cost. So when I talked about universal free school meals, I got told cost. Now I sat for 8 hours on a debate in Afghanistan, and I sat deliberately thinking about this question. Will anyone mention the cost of war? Well, no, they didn't. No one talked about how much that cost us. But as soon as I raised the issue of universal free school meals, I come back with cost. Now, that should be seen as an investment, not cost. And I have to make that point because it's something, I'm so strong on it. I think it's got to be seen as an investment because what we're seeing within our communities. So, Henry never put in a national food strategy. He put elements of it. He backed down a little bit, but he didn't put it in. But let's believe he had the right to food in the national food strategy. And eminent people on here may know more than me in certain circles they operate in. And it was pulled a couple of days before, so we didn't actually include the right to food within the national food strategy, which for us is no problem because it was a free shot at goal. So where we are now, the governments have got to come back in the next 8 months with a response to the national food strategy. this is a wonderful opportunity now, a wonderful opportunity for the trade union movement. Laura's been magnificent working alongside me with Unite, I say the bakers, you know, working with civic society. The Bishop of Liverpool's been magnificent in pushing this message, you know, galvanising everybody around this point now. What an opportunity we've got to pressurise the government into looking at what's happening in our communities and hopefully trying to get the right to food submission. Now, let's not beat around the bush. It's going to be extremely difficult. This is the same government that is going to cut £20 from universal credit. They know what they're doing. But I will say this. I've got a meeting next week with Steve Baker. Because I've seen Steve Baker write, it was one of the headlines about his constituency being one of the poorest hit by food poverty. So I wrote to him and said, well, what are you doing about it? I said, I've got a campaign there. It's not just a Labour campaign, it should be a moral right. It should be, you know, a social injustice within your community, what's happening. So I'm going to sit down, it'll be an interesting meeting. But, you know, that's what we've got to do. We've got to reach out. And this has got to be seen as something which is, you know, across the board. And that's what I'm prepared to do. So moving forward, we've got 8 months to build this movement, what we've been building, and really put rocket boosters on it. Get many more other agencies involved, get many more trade unions, and Christine Blowers here, you know, the NEU have been magnificent as well, because they're seeing it on a day-to-day basis. So for me, the next 8 months are crucial in the right to food, because we've got an opportunity to really push back on what we're going to see in our communities. And as I said, with the fantastic people that we've built so far, and to add to that, I think there's an opportunity to shame this government into actually acknowledging that 15 million people in poverty, 11 million people in food poverty in this 5th richest country is absolutely unacceptable, and we need to change.
Clive?
Thanks, Matt, and it's really great to be here again. Thanks to everyone who organised this, particularly for the Labour campaign and the work you're doing on social and economic rights, which is so important. And it's amazing to meet some of you in person, particularly pay tribute to Ian and to meet him in person for the first time for all the amazing work you've done in the last 2 years. Although I don't thank you for reminding me of a painful football result from yesterday, as we're sitting down. I'm a Spurs supporter. But I just want to say a few things from the point of view of Human Rights Watch as an international human rights organisation. One is, I apologise almost on behalf of part of the human rights movement, as we've seen, or large parts of it around the world, for decades now, have not treated economic, social and cultural rights as the same as other, like the so-called civil and political rights. They are the same. They are part of the same rights. You can't divide them. You can't talk about, let's have some freedom of expression, but people go hungry. Let's have some justice, but no education. There's no division. They're all part of the same Universal Declaration. There's nothing new about this. They were part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 70 years ago. The people who wrote that, the people who came up with the idea of human rights, hadn't just lived through World War II and the Holocaust, they'd lived through depression and hunger, and that's what they were trying to stop by rights. So and the human rights movement, I think, in many parts of the world, people have taken up economic and social rights, and it's a living, breathing idea. It's just in some parts of the world, like the UK, where it seems strange and not really right, or people talk about cost. You don't talk about cost when you're talking about the right to justice. So it's not you shouldn't talk about cost when you talk about the right to not to be hungry. So when we did in Human Rights Watch, it was actually our first big report on the right to food, and we did it in the UK 2 years ago now, partly because we were saying that people will notice, and why should people are going hungry now in one of the richest countries in the world. Why is that happening? And we looked at it and we found it's due to government policy. It's due to government policy on welfare, on cost, on even allowing people to go hungry and allowing people's hunger to be dealt with by charity and not by the state. But also we put in to explain that this is a human right, the right to food. I mean, to a lot of our surprise, it was even that term, the right to food, and even what that means, that got a lot of attention. Not just in the usual places, such as, say, the academics, who would be very interested anyway, but in hashtags, the right to food, in The Daily Mirror did a great campaign about this, explaining what the right to food meant. So, and other people around the world took notice to say, how could one of the richest countries in the world just allow people to go hungry, and increasingly so in the last more than a decade now. So I'll just explain briefly what the right to food could mean, does mean, and to know this is an international right. Around the world, it's been there, it's been accepted, it's dealt with. You can find out, pick up what's been done elsewhere, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel in the UK. It's basically part of the basic right to an adequate standard of living, to a decent standard of living for everyone. And that has been the right since the beginning. It just means all governments should guarantee that everyone has that decent standard of living. And that means everyone has the right to food, to adequate, decent, nutritious food every single day without exception. That right to an adequate standard of living also includes the right to housing, the right to water, and also those other basic rights. So what would a right to food mean in practice? In some ways, the most important thing it would mean is that you take that right, and people understand it's a right. It's not a luxury, it's not charity, it's a human right for everyone. And it means that no one should go hungry. It's basic as that. And it particularly means no one should be going hungry because of government policy, because of government neglect. You normally hold human rights against the state, but it's also states. And in fact, companies have human rights duties. Private sector and the public sector do as well, but the basic duties on government in all its forms, national, local, and international. And what would a human right, though, mean? It shouldn't just be a vague idea, a vague term. It would mean that any policy, any government policy, that is going to cause hunger, that is going to cause people also to be denied adequate, decent food, whoever they are, would be unlawful. And that could be challenged, both when it's in force, but before it comes into force. And of course, there'll be particular people the government has duties towards, those within its care, those it's locked up, whether it's immigration or prison or in hospitals or elsewhere. Those who have particular needs, the vulnerable, including children, those in schools, but it is everybody. So it's any policy, whether it's a policy that disrupts supply, a policy that cuts income so people can't afford food, a policy which causes the price of adequate food to rise. All of that could be challenged. And the crucial part of any human right is that it gives those affected, those you might call victims, but anyone affected, an effective remedy against violations. When a government has violated a human right, like the right to food, every single victim needs an effective remedy to challenge it, to stop what's happening, to stop it in something as urgent as food as quickly as possible, and to get forms of compensation to make sure it never happens again. One other side as well with the right to food, I said it's international. It will affect policies around the world. It affects development policy. If the government's cutting assistance, cooperation in other parts of the world, and that's going to cause people to go hungry, that will be a violation of the right to food as well. You can't see this in isolation. And of course, food markets are global. When the UN experts on the right to food, which they are, and poverty and human rights, look at it, they look at things globally. So it can't be taken in isolation. And supply is global as well. So the right to food affects everything globally. And just briefly to pause, in ways of getting to it, I mean, legally there'll be steps, and the draft bill will be a very good way forward. But there's different ways of getting to these rights. One, I mean, for me, working around the world, the strongest way to secure everyone's human rights is to have a written, functional constitution that guarantees rights, that gives people a remedy, and it cannot be amended. And it includes all those basic rights. And the idea would be to say, you could do this anyway, even to start with by saying every single human rights treaty the UN has joined, has ratified, would be a part of UK law, English, Scottish, and Northern Ireland, and Welsh law, that's just different now. But you would just say it's directly part of it, because the UK is already part of this treaty that's been mentioned, especially the UN Treaty on Economic and Social Rights. But if you go for, it doesn't that's the ideal. But you don't let the best be the enemy of the good, but you could go different ways. You could just say, because there's a momentum around the right to food, give people a special recognition of that, as long as it gives them those same basic legal rights. It says it's the legal right. You can challenge governments before that policies are unlawful, and it gives victims an effective remedy. And I would say anything that gives victims an effective remedy against violations of the right to food, against policies that will allow them to go hungry every day, would be an amazing step forward. But finally, the key point for this is, yes, it's a long way to go. It'll be a way to go before we get there. But even just talking about it, the way that's being talked about now is key. It's saying the solution to hunger is providing food, but it's looking at the causes, and it's saying there is a human right to food. The more we talk about this, the more we talk about what it means, and the more we talk about it globally as well as nationally, the more we get to that stage where it will be an easy step for any progressive government, any government that's more sympathetic to this idea of a right to food as the one now, could make that step, and we can know that we have the powerful means to do that. I'd say it's a global movement. It's something that can be done globally, and I hope very much we work together, both in the UK and globally, to make sure no one should be going hungry again, and when they do, it should be seen as a violation of their human rights. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Clive. Caldo?
Thanks, Matt. It's a privilege and an honour to be with you today and to share the panel with Ian, with Clive, Laura, and Tom. And thanks to the organisers. So I've been asked to reflect a little bit about the relationship between food poverty and human rights, and I'm going to build on what Clive just presented now. So as Clive was saying, economic, social, and cultural rights are recognised in a number of international treaties. Treaties that the UK has voluntarily signed and ratified. So now these treaties were not imposed on the United Kingdom, they were voluntarily accepted by the UK in exercise of its national sovereignty. They were not impositions, they were standards that the UK globally considered appropriate behaviour, and the UK internationally has gone and said, okay, we want to be characterised and defined and meet these standards. But I think the reason why economic and social rights are important here in the UK is much more important than international law, and I lecture about international law on a daily basis, and I still think that there are other things that matter more. I think economic and social rights are very much part of the history of this country. So this is the country of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. This is the country of the Putney Debate 1647, the Levellers and the Diggers. This is the country, this is the home of Mary Wollstonecraft, Thomas Paine, the Chartist, the suffragists, the home of the Council House, the country of the NHS, the burial site of Karl Marx. Social rights are very much part of the history of this country, and it's actually, for those of us who were not born here, such as myself, I am quite proud of being and living in this country precisely because I think this legacy makes this country great. So social rights are very much parts of the history of the country, and those who may claim that social rights are alien to the UK, international, even worse, European, well, actually they are not. They are very much parts of what this country is. In comparative practice, if we look at constitutions around the world, or legal systems around the world, most of them, the vast majority of them, recognize economic and social rights either in the constitutions or in other fundamental laws in their countries. The UK is an exception. The UK legal system does not it doesn't have, as we know, a written constitution, and the fundamental law on human rights, which is the Human Rights Act, which is essential, we need to preserve it, as important as it is, does not include economic and social rights in it. So we need something else. We need additional standards on economic and social rights. Having said that, the fact that economic and social rights are not recognized in a constitution or in the law does not mean that the UK is every single day violating economic and social rights. We can make the case that years of austerity, years of government that have given the back to progressive policies on housing and food and social security, that amounts to a violation of economic and social rights. But the fact that these rights are not in the Constitution in itself does not mean that economic and social rights are being constantly violated. After all, Clement Attlee did not need a written constitution or economic and social rights to implement, and his governments to implement the NHS and to build council houses. So I think it's important to distinguish, and also not to overpromise with the idea of human rights and a human rights approach to food or to housing. I think a human rights-based approach offers a lot, but the fact that we don't have human rights or social rights in a constitution by itself does not mean that rights are being breached. However, This country has has achieved a lot of the years at certain points in its history in protecting economic and social rights in practice. And I think a human rights-based approach can add value to the good policies that have been adopted at certain times in the history of this country. So let's get practical. What does a human rights-based approach offer to those of us who want to put an end to food banks and reduce inequalities? So a few practical things. I think the first contribution of a human rights-based approach is that we'll be recognizing that there is a certain standard of adequate behavior, that we are all entitled to an adequate standard of living, which is recognized in international law as a human right. And for the fifth or the sixth largest economy in the world, we should not accept anything less than the principle that everyone in this society should be entitled to an adequate standard of living. The fifth or sixth largest economy simply cannot afford anything less than that. We should not accept a standard that is lower than that. That means that for a rich economy such as this one, we already have the necessary resources to ensure an adequate standard of living for everyone. But some of those resources may be publicly owned, some others, many others, are privately owned. So that's why taking a human rights-based approach to policy means thinking about taxation as well. What taxes do we need in order to ensure the principle, because the principle is the starting point, that everyone should be entitled to an adequate standard of living. So rather than saying this is the pocket of money, this is the amount of money that I have, and I'm going to do the best I can with this amount, I'm going to recognize that everyone should be entitled to an adequate standard of living. And some people, by work, simply will not be able to earn enough money to ensure an adequate standard of living for them and their family. And we need to come up with a clever system using private and public resources to compensate and to give the resources to those who cannot get the money in the private sector. So talking about taxation, talking about private resources, it means taking human rights seriously. Taking non-retrogression seriously. This country has gone, in the 2010s, went through austerity. This country was not the only country going through austerity. Other countries went through austerity as well. But in other countries where social rights are part of the legal system, such as Germany in Article 20 of the Constitution, courts had the means to ensure that austerity measures that were implemented there, because UK was not alone on this, had to meet with the standard of adequacy and dignity of Article 1 and Article 20 of the Constitution. That's something that UK courts fell short in doing because there is no such thing as a right to adequate standard of living in our legal system, unlike Germany and unlike many other countries. So if we took the right to adequate standard of living and food seriously, our courts would be empowered to do more. It's also about shifting the burden of proof. So there are loads of global NGOs, smaller NGOs, there are loads of academics and researchers working on social rights. But at the end of the day, when there are so many people in poverty and in destitution in a country, at some point we need to shift the burden of proof. The state, the government has all the information and we don't. And so there is so much we can do with our research skills and the talent that all people have, but at the end of the day, it should be the state, the one that proves that they are actually making use of all available resources to satisfy an adequate standard of living. They should not be on us, because there is only so much evidence we can put together. It should be the government the one that proves. And if they don't prove it, then there will be an indication that they are not meeting economic and social rights. And it would also require paying attention to people who are affected the most. So when you cut £20 from universal credit, you need to be aware that it's not just £20 on average in society. It's actually people whose lives depend on these £20. So you are taking a decision that has a certain economic value, but people who are paying the price are some people who are affected the most, and they are at greater risk of harm and disadvantage in society. Final thought. Some people, even people on the left, think that economic and social rights or a human rights-based approach to social justice may sound good, but in practice, what does it mean? And it doesn't sound like the sort of thing we should do when we want to claim power to the people. Because when you use the word rights, some people think this is giving too much power to courts, right? So a lot of people think what we need is to, have a Labour Prime Minister, have clear majority in Parliament, and then we will implement policies that are for social justice. We don't need bills, and we don't need to give power to judges. I will counter-argue that with three ideas. The first one, recognizing human rights and recognizing social rights is not about giving more power to judges. It's about us as society making clear what sort of society we want to be and what we believe everyone in this society should be entitled to. It's about our democratic wish. It's not about taking power from parliament to courts. It's about saying publicly who we want to be. Secondly, taking social rights seriously is about ensuring the material conditions of freedom. It's about being free and ensuring that everyone is free. And when you are hungry, you're not really truly free. You may be free to speak, free to write, but if you're hungry and if your people are hungry, your freedom is being curtailed. So it's very much about the basic principle of liberty and freedom. And thirdly, it's also about citizenship, like T.H. Marshall used to say. It's about social citizenship. It's about what we need in order to ensure that all of us can contribute meaningfully to society. So ensuring social rights for all is about us being free and it's about us being good citizens. Thank you.
Thanks, Caldo. Laura?
Thank you very much. I'm going to set a timer because I have a habit of rabbiting on. I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And also, I'm doing that thing where I'm looking at my phone, but it's because I've got a 5-year-old daughter which is not very well, and she's up in Crewe and it's horrible. So I'm checking that she's okay. So I'm not tweeting and not listening. I am listening, but anybody who has kind of experienced that, why is it always when you go away, right? Always when you go away. Listen, I was asked to talk a little bit about my experience of poverty and what I saw when I became the Labour MP for Crewe and Nantwich back in 2017. I'm going to go back before that actually and just explain why it was that I actually got involved in politics and what took me on that journey. And it was my children, because I made a decision that I had to do everything that I possibly could to change things for them, their future, and the next generation. And why was that? Well, I was a primary school teacher before I became a politician and before I started working at Unite. And it was around the time that austerity had hit, and you could see it, you could feel it. It was there looking at me every single day in the classroom. And it wasn't just empty bellies, it was children dealing with the stress and the worry of what was going on at home. And this gets forgotten about. And actually the reason I became a primary school teacher was because, and I'm getting a little bit sick of this because everybody seems to now be talking about they grew up in poverty. You hear it all the time, but I did grow up in poverty, and I wanted to become a primary school teacher because I never felt that the system was looking out for me. I didn't want charity. I didn't want to have like a pat on the back and Paul Laura from the poor family and this kind of, didn't want that. I just wanted equal opportunities. I didn't want to see my mum going around the supermarket, adding up as she went round, seeing people paying with credit cards. And I used to think, what are they? What are those things? Because my family didn't have them. And I could see that these kids in my class and what they were facing, I could see the stress on their faces and that they were dealing with that kind of worry. Because it's not just the right to food, is it? It's the right to a decent home. It's the right to the appliances to be able to prepare a meal properly. It's the right to know that your family can go out to work, get a decent wage and provide. And look, let's not beat about the bush. I don't buy this, there's no money. I really don't. And I'm disappointed that that's the line that's coming out. Because as Ian rightly said, there's enough money to go to war. There's enough money when a pandemic hits. We've proven that the government can basically change things and print money if it's needed. Why are our kids not important enough? Why are people in communities like Crewe not important enough? Why is that not enough of a reason? And I don't get it. Because actually, if you look after a community, if you invest in a community, that community will give back and everybody will benefit. But what we have now, we have this inequality, because let's face it, the only way these people up at the top continue to get rich and wealthy is if they're making sure that these people down at the bottom are pushed right down. And we're seeing it at the moment with the debate about HGV drivers, right? I'm sick of people almost wanting to bring in cheap labour into this country, exploit them, pay them nothing to make sure that my car's full. Why is the debate not pay them properly? Offer them enough money so that they can actually provide for their families. And what struck me when I became an MP was, and it was a lorry driver, was the one of the first experiences. He was a single guy. He was using the food bank, and it was the food bank who were telling me this. They said he was sleeping in his lorry, no longer had housing, had gone through a relationship breakup. He was using the food bank. He was massively depressed because obviously when you've got no money, your mental health is affected hugely. And his job was to get in a huge lorry and drive. And because he wasn't being looked after, because his mental health wasn't being looked after, that puts a lot of other people in danger as well. Let's be honest about it. I just don't get how we are living in a system where people like lorry drivers, why people like care workers, why people like teachers, why people who are working in our NHS, who have kept us going through this pandemic. I don't understand why we live in a society where they're not paid enough to be able to meet the basic standards that everybody deserves. So, look, as a Unite national political officer, which I'm really pleased to be able to be now, and as somebody who I'm also a local councillor for Cheshire East, it's been great to get involved with this campaign with Ian and others, and to help get that motion put through, to help promote this campaign and to make sure the word's getting out there. And we will continue to do everything that we possibly can to support with that. But what I really want to see, and why I like the fans supporting food bank model, is I find it a little bit food banks now, because they're places where Tory MPs go and have pictures, and they're places where, you know, people will pop in and they'll feel good about themselves because they're donating to a food bank. I got a letter from my kids' school saying that now, you know, it's a regular thing that we all donate to the food bank. Now, I totally believe in solidarity to people. I want to do that. But I said to my children, we need to be asking the question, why is this happening and how do we stop it? I think every single food bank should be signed up to campaigning against this, to talking about the reasons why this is happening in our country, else they shouldn't exist. Because the aim should always be to get rid of this kind of charity, because people shouldn't have to rely on it. People want dignity. They want to be able to look after their own families. They don't just want to have to be looking to when you get a kind of government who might help you out a bit more. We need to change the structures in this country. We need to tax the wealthy far more in this country. We need to take on the people who are making money out of workers whilst filling their, you know, we've got a chancellor in this country who is getting planning permission for tennis courts and all sorts of crap, you know, while we have kids who can't eat and we have footballers who are doing the campaigning. What is this? I said the other day I was having a conversation with my family, and I've become one of those people who nobody invites round because I'm a total fun sponge, right? Because once you get involved in this, you can't put the milk back in the bottle. So you just stop getting invited to things, or they say, Laura, just stop. Because most of my friends, it's too depressing for them to be able to take this on, to be able to focus and look at. The reality is, the people who we need to be helping the most aren't often engaged in politics. Full stop. How do we reach them? And we have a duty to be able to get to them, to get them involved. I believe that it's looking locally. I believe it's getting involved in communities. I believe it is getting involved in trade unions. I think it is about joining those things together. I think it is no offence, because I was one, and I think you're an amazing one. I think it is taking the focus away from Westminster all the time and the energy that bubble sucks in from everybody. We have power to change things, we do. But we have to organise, plan, and go out and do that work. Because I don't think that somebody in Westminster is going to wave the wand and save us, not unless we demand it, which is exactly what Marcus Rashford did. He shamed them into acting. And to coin a phrase I actually liked, we are the many, right? The people who want to change stuff. They are the few, the people who are exploiting people for their own benefit. I am going to round up. My timer went off and I ignored it because, why not? And also, like, Ian and I are just, look at our speeches. I mean, you can't even read them, can you? It's just scrawl. But I know that I'll look through it at the end and think, oh no, I didn't say that. Tories, right? Tories, and you're meeting with one. Good luck. Good luck when you meet him. I'm sure, and you're right to reach out to them, because the fact is, some of them aren't on this planet. They don't. Their constituencies that they represent are full of cows and sheep, and they don't represent people. They don't know the reality of it. And they don't see this one. The amount of times I would have these debates with some of them, and they seemed oblivious. Now, I'm not stupid, because I think Tory MPs are just the face of what's going on behind. They work for the money, for the city, all of these things. That's what their aim is. But some of these people, they need a reality check. They need it put in front of them. They need people like Ian shoving the ugly reality of what is going on because of the way that they vote in front of them. And what I actually want to see is, I want to see members of Parliament owning the way they vote. I think there should be a billboard in every constituency telling people and informing them the way that their MP votes. Because come an election, the guy who took my seat, I mean, my God, he sounded great on his seat. He was all for schools, he loved hospitals, he loved it all. He doesn't vote like that, does he? But people don't engage enough to see the reality, and they are fed the lies, and they are fed this nonsense. Let's get billboards out everywhere. How did your MP vote? As soon as they start getting shamed into it publicly, then they might start thinking a little bit more, because most of them don't even read the papers that come out. They walk into this is great, right? Because nobody thought I'd ever get into Parliament. I'm like the biggest gossip. Just tell people the reality of it. You walk in, yes lobby, no lobby. Most of the time you find them, they don't have a clue what they're voting for. The biggest decisions in our country, and they haven't even bothered to read, to look. They're that privileged that they don't even think that is necessary. I walked in there, when I went into Westminster, it was the first time I'd ever walked in there as an MP, right? I thought these people were smart. The reality was, if only we could get ordinary people in there, they'd do such a better job, because they actually care and they know the reality of what people face. I said we wouldn't focus on Westminster and that bubble. It's absolutely right. The drive has to be outside of the organising. Then you will naturally find the excellent people who should be going in there, like Ian. I am going to wrap up now, and I'm this was a waste of the 3 minutes it took for me to scribble my notes. We can change this. It is completely unjust. How do we do it? Tackle that inequality issue. Don't let them keep getting away with it. Tax the rich, change the system, change the way this economy runs, and look, give people the dignity that they deserve, because poor people don't want charity. They just want the opportunity. And the fact is that if you're born with your hands tied behind your back because of the situation in your family, that you're not likely to be able to get on the housing ladder, that you're less likely to be able to go to university, that all of these things. People have said to me before, but you did it, Laura, you escaped poverty. No, I was just lucky. Most people aren't. And we need to change that. Thank you so much for having me.
And finally, Tom.
Yeah, thanks very much. Like everybody else, I'm also grateful, but I'm going to really get a speed on because I know we've kind of run out of time. If people think you're depressing, Laura, people think I'm really, really depressing. Because I'm going to talk about the relationship with crime, in relation to poverty. I'm an assistant police and crime commissioner for the West Midlands. The PCC is elected Labour politician and a devolved power that actually has an awful lot of opportunity to campaign on issues relating to poverty. Because there's a profound link between poverty and crime, which I think you would obviously know about. I do want to say, we do have to be really, really careful when we talk about poverty related to crime, because it's a hugely stigmatising thing to say. Obviously, the vast majority of people in society don't commit crime, and the vast majority of people who come from poverty don't commit crime. And it can actually really fuel very hostile narratives about people. Those same kind of narratives about scroungers and people who choose to commit crimes. We've got to be really careful. However, it would be ridiculous not to talk about the link between poverty and crime when it is so real, evidenced academically, evidenced by what everybody sees with their own eyes, what I've seen with my own eyes. So we really can't oversimplify the issue. But the helpful way of talking about the link between the two is to characterise it as it deserves to be characterised. When poverty, and that includes hunger, does lead to crime, it's because of desperation, not a choice. It's not a simplistic cost-benefit analysis, but a rational actor is deciding to make a good choice on, which is how economic papers sometimes present it, which is embarrassing and annoying. It's also often about exploitation. It's not just desperation, but vulnerability. And it's that underlying poverty and lack of options that really drives that kind of vulnerability. And then there's a complex interplay with loads of other problems, which actually Laura was touching upon. So what I would say is it's not always an election-winning focus, this, to talk about the link between poverty and crime. It's not something you necessarily stand on. But irrespective of that, there are some things which are so big and they're so important, you can't just strategize about it. And if we don't talk about it, no one is going to do it. And we can still use the middle ground arguments around crime at times. We don't have enough police officers, that's just a fact. There's domestic abuse calls which aren't getting responded to. So we can still talk, relatively tough on crime, but we have to be the party that stands up and really talks about this link. And I thought this is helpful to talk through how it interrelates to other major social problems of the day, which also call for more social rights. Because talking about this helps us persuade those who have some of that hostile narrative communicated to them. It's the anxiety that is caused by poverty and hunger that can lead to profound mental ill health. Profound mental ill health can lead to substance misuse. Substance misuse can lead to homelessness and family breakdown. Poverty and hunger can trap people in abusive relationships. Women not knowing how to escape because they're worried that their terrible situation now might get worse. Homelessness as well as hunger, and maybe other abuse from somebody else looking to exploit it. Now, obviously, these factors aren't always present, and they're not always present at the same time, and they don't always come in the same order. But these social rights that we're talking about, they're there to tackle this whole gamut of social and welfare deficit, which impacted each other in a spiralling desperation. Just a couple of examples. You've seen in the West Midlands, so many women get caught in the criminal justice system because they're shoplifting repeatedly to feed themselves and their children. Even the tiniest bit of investigation into their case, when society is prepared to do that, shows this history of domestic abuse, often exploitation into sex work or otherwise, homelessness, and then a whole gamut of other issues around learning needs. And then you start to talk about what does the right of education or right to education really mean? Because in society, we are really letting people down. You've got kids whose learning needs aren't being diagnosed. You've got children whose learning needs are being diagnosed, and it's the first budget to go, or it's not appreciated, or there's still a stigma attached to those people not being intelligent, which is ridiculous, factually incorrect. These are the issues that then spiral into their most acute form of social harm, which is crime. Now, I'm just going to end here, because I know we've run out of time, on a really, I think, actually, point of optimism. In Birmingham, which is a very Labour stronghold, there's some just people taking the solutions into their own hands. Now, I definitely want to see radical change in the amount of investment we have in our country. We need it, because it's not sustainable, this kind of local leadership, without that support. But the really clever stuff is when we recognise that food poverty is very rarely on its own. Domestic abuse is very rarely on its own. Substance misuse, mental ill health. They're so often there together. So what I'd like to really encourage the lawyers to do, and I'm a lawyer myself, although thanks actually to free school meals that were given to me as a child, for which I'm extremely grateful for, and therefore will always campaign for that for other people. I want the lawyers to think creatively about how they help policymakers, whether it's politicians, people on the ground, community leaders, recognise this intertwining of issues. Because the best stuff I see is when departments work together to help people really holistically through this complex cocktail of what poverty really looks like in society. And the best stuff I've seen in Birmingham has really succeeded with that. And it is so exciting to see, because it's reform at its absolute best. So I'll end there with just that little glimmer of optimism.